So yeah, this is a subject that I've been interested in for a long time, especially once I moved here to Oklahoma. It started in my postdoc and has continued into my professorship here. And that's exactly what impact severe weather is having on natural populations, in particular birds, but other populations as well. First off, I just want to acknowledge that this work involves a lot of people working on a lot of different projects that I'm going to dovetail together. A lot of funding agencies, including the ODWC, NSF, recent award from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So a big hat tip to them. This wouldn't be possible without this huge team of grad students and volunteers. So when we talk about severe weather, I just want to put it out there in terms of how I might define it. I'm sure we all have our own definitions, but I'm thinking about these transient climate extremes that are linked to wider atmospheric processes. And when it comes to populations, you have this obvious variation in the weather at a local spot that individuals or populations are experiencing. And we all have this, we can all think of this comfort zone that we can be in, where temperatures, for instance, are quite comfortable and everybody can tolerate it. And as we move out of that into this so-called tolerance zone, we have to invoke some sort of behavioral adaptations or physiological adaptations to deal with it. So here, these budgies in Australia have moved into the shadows to reduce the amount of thermal radiation that's heating them up. As we go beyond that, for populations, we start talking about selection events, where certain individuals aren't as well adapted to this, and they start dying. And hopefully this leads to some local adaptations if this is a regular event that's occurring. And of course, they're in the catastrophic zone where everyone dies. This can be generally in two directions. So we can think of temperature and precipitation being too hot, too cold, too dry, too wet, or largely unidirectional. So for instance, hailstorms, hurricanes, ice storms. Though I will acknowledge that some species actually thrive, for instance, in the aftermath of hurricanes. So when we think about catastrophes, they really can be a game changer. And for those, you don't have to think of what the forecast is going to be on Friday or Saturday when Thursday is the apocalypse. So we're talking about events that can cause local extinctions, or even in some cases global extinctions. But it's not that's not all we need to focus on. There is, again, tolerance selection zones that we have to be focused in on. So severe weather, some people.
Hey, Jeremy, real quick, people are having a kind of a hard time to hear you. So if you could hold your mic, maybe that might help.
Oh, okay. Let me pull out this. Help if I don't have my ear plugs in. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, that sounds a lot better.
That sounds a lot better. Okay, my apologies. So we could, a synonymous term we could use for severe weather is an extreme climatic event. And Vanderpoels et al. Put out a special issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society B, but they talked about what is exactly extreme, because we might want to define it based on climatic variables. And that might be true. That might indeed be the case if there is a one-to-one relationship between rises in a certain climatic variable, say for instance temperature, and the so-called biological response. But if there's any sort of disjunct between that, between the climate and the biological response, you may be looking at a more extreme climatic event that is even registering as impactful on a population, especially those that are quite adapted to extreme conditions. So if we have variation across the range of species, it may fit that first model, where that variation might be too extreme for the certain tree species as you get further north or further south. But we all know that there is predispositions within species, there is geographic variation within species, and therefore with the exact same weather regime, various populations could be affected differently throughout that range. So I want you to focus in on impact-based definitions for extreme, rather than the climatologically based definitions of that. So to understand this, we need to look at what are really locally unpredictable and transient events, which is very difficult to do if you're if you're in the field studying biology. And then I want to lead into what exactly can managers to do to prevent and mitigate these impacts, because if we can't do anything about them, do we really need to worry about them as much? Or is it just a natural phenomenon? So this, as we all realize, climate occurs at a variety of scales. And so when we're talking about extreme climatic events, generally we're going to be focusing in at the local scale for each event, but in the aggregate, this is impacting populations across their entire range. There is obviously a spatial aspect to it. Some places get hit, some places don't. Certain habitats will be more resilient to impacts versus not. And depending on what the factor is, what the event is, it can affect a lot of vegetative and inorganic components, which are, of course, important for predicting species ranges and occupancy. It can affect connectivity on those landscapes. And then when we're talking about the temporal aspects of it, Monica's talk about the fire and rainfall begetting fire or drought begetting more drought is important to think about, because it's not occurring as a snapshot here. You have to understand the full history of the landscape, either evolutionary or contemporary. And of course, these are interplaying with each other. So we need to think about scales. And of course, the hardest one to focus in on is the local scale, where, of course, weather is really being experienced by the individual or the population. And the problem with focusing at those small scales is that it's very hard to tease apart any sort of signature of adaptation, versus at the global scale, it's a lot easier to do so. You can look at range limits and so on and so forth. So how do we really go about attributing impacts to extreme climatic events? How do we know when they're extreme for the populations? If we want to study the weather in a given place, we might have the fact that we're going into an area after a hurricane or a tornado or a drought or a flood, and gathering data that didn't have any before aspects to it. We might not be able to access those areas because of the danger aspect of it. If this is immediately after a hurricane, there could be a lot of hazards for people. Obviously, this is unreplicable in the sense of exactly reproducing it. There's a lot of confounding covariates in an area that's heavily damaged. Your detectability is going to be very difficult. It's non-random on the landscape, so it's where the tornado passed is where it passed. You can't randomize its movement across the landscape, and you risk being accused of pseudo-replication because it could be considered one event. The fact is that we've studied disasters of another nature in the past, and those being man-made or artificial disasters like oil spills, and have a framework to look at those. So Williams and Barker back in the mid-90s wrote this framework where they subcategorized the approaches based upon complexity. And so you have the first category of before after, if you're so fortunate to have a baseline or you have pre-event studies. You can have a single time where you go out after the fact and study it as intensely as you can, or you can look at it across, for instance, a time series where you look at how the ecosystem recovers. You can compare it to other areas around the point of impact and get a sense of what is normal based upon natural fluctuations that would have occurred anyway. So you can get some sort of a flow chart. So it may look complex, but it depends on what presents itself to you in terms of how detailed data you can collect and analyze. But what I'm saying is it's possible. It's possible despite all those roadblocks, and it's important, just as it was important to study the Exxon Valdez oil spill, for instance. In the silviculture industry, this has been done for a long time to understand what makes a tree more vulnerable to, for instance, ice storms. And this slide comes courtesy of Heather McCarthy here at OU. And understanding that can tell you how severe you expect ice storms to affect stands of forests and when you should harvest them to avoid catastrophic losses. In terms of animals, we can also see a similar gradient of impacts, all the way from outright being killed to all the way down to just being stressed out and taxed for energy or losing time. As this on the left-hand side, this is a migratory ovenbird that has no business being in the snow. So it likely survived that, but it probably slowed down its migration and cost it a lot of energy stores. Versus the caribou on the right-hand side, which were all struck by lightning because they tended to herd together during a very rare thunderstorm in the Arctic, and one bolt of lightning killed them all because, again, they didn't have the proper behavioral adaptations, because convective storms were so rare in the Arctic. They didn't, there was no opportunity for selection. So severe weather can really occur throughout the life cycle. We're familiar with that here in the Southern Great Plains. But there are also potentially high risk periods when it can affect populations. For birds, this is nesting. For any species, during the peak reproduction period, this is a critical period or time of the life cycle. I want to focus in on birds, partly because that's what I study, but also because they're ubiquitous on the landscape. They're relatively easy to detect, and they're quite fragile. One study that I collaborated on with a student, Amber Carver in Colorado, was this study on grassland birds, where she had her study looking just at the ecology of the grassland birds. It was hit by a major hailstorm, and she ended up losing a number of nests. And we looked at the distribution of those nests relative to the hail. And hail was a major factor in contributing to it, but explaining even more so of the relationship was wind-driven hail. So it was as the hail got bigger, if there was a high degree of wind shear, if it was being driven sideways, if you will, then even smaller hailstones could have this catastrophic impact on a nest. So it goes to show you that it's not only hail, but it's the winds associated with these convective storms that's having an impact. If you go through the literature, you find examples of likely impacts that were kind of glossed over just because it's something that's seen as an outlier, not something worthy of its own paper. But in this paper by Dan Catlin et al., they found that in 2009 there were severe hailstorms, and you look at the change in the distribution from 2008 to 2009, and it dwarfs the impacts of these owl removals that was central to their study system. So rather than publish on the obvious impact of hailstorms, they published on this more minor impact of owl removal. So you see examples of self-censoring among scientists, not wanting to put out these anecdotes, but even though they're quite valuable. So there's also other parts of the life cycle that are important. For birds, there's this period when they have to replace a lot of their feathers. You can imagine for a lot of species, there are critical stages when there's energetically expensive activities going on. And migration is also a huge energy demanding period. And during these periods, they can be individuals and populations can aggregate into certain areas. And when severe weather hits, you can have massive losses. So in this paper or this upcoming paper, hopefully, where I'm collaborating with John Neal out of Utah, there was a thunderstorm that came through the Great Salt Lake area and devastated thousands at the minimum of these redneck phalaropes that were passing through that area. So you can have a situation where organisms can be at critical life stages, and these severe weather events, these extreme climatic events, can have huge impacts. As I mentioned, there's aggregations are also are of major concern, because you have within a very small spatial area the opportunity for a storm to have massive impacts. And we're increasingly recognizing that birds and other species are doing this during the winter months. They're aggregating together because they're not territorial anymore. They're cooperatively looking for resources. And when they're in that state, when they're grouped up, as one of our study species, the chestnut-collared longspur, are, they can be vulnerable to extreme events. So extreme cold snap, extreme snowfall event when they can't find as many seeds. And there are questions there whether or not this is partly contributing to declines that we're seeing within these species. For instance, the chestnut-collared longspur has declined nearly 90% since the 1960s. And Oklahoma really is at the heart of the wintering distribution. So a big project of ours is to look at how well they're surviving the winter and whether or not they're succumbing to extremes. When we're looking at distribution of that particular species across the state, it can be done at a coarse scale, which corresponds with grasslands that are available. But really, when you're a bird, here's what you're seeing in the landscape. You have a very limited perspective. And in fact, this bird is often choosing quite heterogeneous habitats where there's a mixture of anywhere from bare ground to thick grass. And that thick grass seems to be very important for nighttime roosting, as well as during these cold snaps. They aggregate in large numbers into these stands of grass that have a lot of seed availability. So understanding how they're moving across the landscape is important. This is a very similar thing happens with this other longspur species, the Smith's longspur. And what this is potentially affecting is if you're going out and doing surveys, especially if you're going out and doing a survey after an extreme climatic event, you'd have to keep in mind what the detectability is of the species. Because if you see 50 individuals in a group, that could represent all the individuals for 100 hectares area, versus under good conditions, those individuals could be spread across a much larger area. So understanding the biology of the species and how they're responding to the weather is really critical for us to understand how they're responding to them behaviorally, those events, of course. So we're also tracking these birds across the landscape, seeing how they move relative to each other, what habitats they're using relative to these extreme weather events. And we have a focus here in Oklahoma, and hoping to take this to fields beyond. And there's a lot of interest from ODWC to know this because a lot of wintering species have been so completely understudied. We don't understand what's going on and if Oklahoma is contributing to the losses we're seeing in those species. I'll just skip over that. So you can also have times when there are, of course, sublethal impacts. As I mentioned before, it's not only about climate change induced extremes outright killing individuals, but it's making their lives that much harder. So in terms of developmental signatures, we had an interesting situation here where we were studying this species of sparrow, and when we were catching it in the late fall, we were noticing these so-called fault bars. This is not a normal looking tail here. These fault bars across the tail, and they were synchronous, which is very curious, suggesting that something happened to that bird at some point when it was developing those feathers, and it was at a very high level. 2/3 of all the birds we were catching had these fault bars. These fault bars are signatures of stress. It's malformations in the feathers that impact their ability to wear properly, to fly properly. And so we were very curious about what was going on. But when we looked at the map, here was our study site in El Reno, and we had gone there in the fall of 2013, and you know, I was quite aware of what happened in El Reno, as many of you may have as well. And in 2013, that massive F5 tornado poured through the area. It didn't hit our study site per se, but if you looked at what fell in that area, we had tennis ball size hail immediately right over top of our study site. And you can imagine if you're a sparrow the size of maybe your thumb, a tennis ball sized hailstone is quite stressful and likely impacted their accessibility to resources, let alone killed a lot of individuals on the nest. So the ones that were fortunate enough to make it through had these scars really on their feathers. And so we looked at the stable isotope signatures of them and just boiling it down very quickly. When you look at the nitrogen stable isotopes, it can tell you about whether or not the individual was starving and was starting to metabolize some of its own muscle tissue. And indeed, that's really what we found here, is in the fault bar region, and then immediately downstream of the fault bar region, there was an elevated signature of heavy nitrogen stable isotopes, indicating that these birds had starved. So it was an interesting observation. We didn't follow those birds throughout their lifetime, but this developmental delay in these birds could have had a lifetime impact, all because of one bad day in May of 2013. Of course, behaviorally, you can have sublethal impacts that can affect individuals and populations. And this is another line of study that we're taking up in my lab and looking at aridity. Aridity can very much impact birds. And there's some amazing adaptations within the bird community to aridity for saving precious water resources. So you can have an anatomical adaptations inside the nose for saving water vapor. You can have radiative heat loss like the sand grouse here. A lot of birds you'll see even around campus or around your town on a very hot day, panting, opening up their wings, exposing certain parts of their body to try to cool themselves down. And it's amazing that you look at the beak of a bird and you think of it as being almost like a bone-like structure, but it is a living tissue, make no mistake. And that living tissue can actually radiate off a lot of heat. So it is itself its own thermal regulatory organ. But of course, that organ has to do a lot of other things for birds. They don't have thumbs. So they not only have to thermoregulate with it, they have to forage with it, and it's actually part of their vocal tract, so it affects their singing. So in these arid environments, the shape of that beak and how it's functioning can affect its function for other things such as foraging and singing. What's interesting about bird song in arid environments, and this really blew me away when I got into it, is that the ability of sound to transmit through air isn't constant. And as relative humidity and temperature changes, the attenuation of that sound changes as a function of those local conditions. In particular, at the higher pitches, they're often associated with kind of the more attractive males that females will choose. And so you can have a situation where a male starting to sing early in the morning when it's cool in a desert-like environment, his song projects quite well. But as it heats up during the day, you're not adding more moisture in, but you're adding temperature. All of a sudden, his song is not heard from as far afield. The more he has to sing, the more he also loses water as a factor of singing. So he's kind of in between a rock and a hard place in this. And there's an interesting dynamic going on there, where as you're moving up this temperature humidity gradient and not being heard from as far, you're also losing more water. When you lose more water, you have to have a bigger territory to gain those resources back. Having a bigger territory means you have to patrol a bigger area, which means you need to sing more, which means you're losing more water, which means you need a bigger territory. So it can become this vortex that you're falling into where populations can quickly become non-functional as a social species. So a very interesting aspect going on here where desert bird communities that a lot of people gravitate towards and want to hear are going silent earlier in the morning, potentially as a result of this. So right now we have a pilot study going on in southwestern Oklahoma with some supplementary feeders, some automated recording units, and some and linking it to weather stations from the Mesonet, and looking at local weather conditions on a 10-minute basis, and linking that to the singing propensity of different species and how often they're visiting these supplemental water resources, to try to link up whether or not that this releases them from that water stress and allows them to compete better with other males who don't have access to those extra water resources. So some exciting things going on, and from a management perspective, directly relates to the aspects of wildlife guzzlers that are quite popular in the West, in the American West. So just to review again, we can have adaptations for thermal tolerance, either at the hot end or the cold end. We can have adaptive behaviors that can be perhaps more malleable. We can look at habitat usage and availability that allow individuals and populations to seek refuge during these times of extreme climate. And also potentially how it affects different ages and sexes, because there's different phenologies of when each sex emerges or arrives back on its breeding grounds, and so on and so forth. So it's a lot to take in, but without understanding how these species are responding to the existing climate, we would have a really hard time understanding how they will respond to the changing climate. So some people might say, so what? These are natural disasters. These are natural communities. They'll bounce back. And this is often what you'll get from the public, is that we don't need to worry about what happens to natural communities, because they've always gone through it and they've always pulled through. And I teamed up with Joe Ripberger and others at the Center for Risk and Crisis Management here at OU, and we put in some questions into the existing MSysNet quarterly survey program that's done here in Oklahoma, a really powerful resource that calls thousands of Oklahoma households every 3 months and asks them their opinions about stuff. And we put in some questions about whether or not people were concerned about natural communities and the impacts of extreme climatic events or severe weather. And you can see here on the left a distribution of how people thought, how people viewed nature in terms of its fragility versus robustness. And you saw on the whole, most people viewed nature as relatively robust. Some thought it was extremely robust, could bounce back no matter what. A lot fewer viewed it as extremely fragile. And that correlated well, at least at these lower levels, with their concern for how this is how severe weather is impacting these natural communities. On the right is almost the same question, you could argue, but worded differently, where people were asked about their concern for the preservation of natural resources versus the potential ecological impacts of weather. And you can see along this line here, which would be a perfect relationship, where somebody who's very concerned about the ecological impacts would also be concerned about the preservation of natural resources, and that falls out quite well. But what's interesting is this, what I call this opportunity zone of people who are concerned about, say, for instance, quail or deer or fish surviving through periods of drought or floods, so on and so forth, that don't equate that as being an ecological, don't equate that with ecological damage from those severe weather impacts. So they might think of preserving deer populations, but they may not realize that deer populations could be knocked back by, you know, some severe flooding events, or of course, wildfires and drought. So there's definitely an opportunity there. And if you can convince people that this linkage can be made, I think a lot of support could sway towards mitigating these impacts. So to understand the resiliency and the recovery, and I realize I haven't exactly classified that, but resiliency is just maintaining the health of the population or the biological community through this extreme climatic event, or recovery, there's some sort of downfall, and then that community returns to that original state. But to understand that, we really need to understand at some species levels how they may be predisposed to deal with periodic disasters, because a drought may not affect certain species of trees, and I think we recognize this. And how might this have been undermined by changes in not only climate change, but land use? And the way I come at talking about this with people is that you can set aside climate change, which is obviously going to make extremes worse, and just look at the landscape and say, okay, if populations would have always bounced back in the past, they may have bounced back because they were well connected, because there was a lot of available habitat that was within close proximity to one another. And as we've changed the land use, the ability of these natural populations to repopulate themselves after local extinctions may not be there anymore. So to understand that ability to recolonize and recover after these extreme climatic events is important. And understanding what works for species is also important. And I put this graphic here of the cattle because we understand what works for domesticated species. This reminds me of an argument I had with my brother about the need to keep trees in the landscape, because he wanted to chop them all down so he could have as much grass for the cows to eat as possible. But then I said, well, what are those cows going to do on those extremely hot days when they're going to be sweating, they're going to be using up a lot of these crucial water resources? And thankfully, he left a number of trees in the landscape. And this is not from his farm, but this is basically what you see is during these extremely hot days, his cattle gather underneath the trees. And you'll see this with wild populations as well. So understanding what works for them is important. This term fire escape habitats has been adopted within the migratory bird community. And so it was an easy translation of me taking it from that field to a severe weather ecology, because these fire escapes were deemed critical, especially by Jeff Bueller, who coined the term, for these trans-Gulf migrants who are crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean, exhausted after a 24-hour flight. And if they're facing all of a sudden a headwind, they may have to go to the very first stand of trees, no matter how good of quality it is, because their very survival depends upon it. So these habitats highlighted in red, he classified them as fire escapes. And a fire escape is not somewhere where you live, but it allows you to live. It allows these birds to land, rest. They may not even refuel, but it allows them to move on to better habitats once this critical stage has passed. So I think we could approach it the same way. And I overheard a land manager talking about the fact that when we manage a landscape, we have to think about having all of the rooms available for all the species. So if you want to think about this as an apartment building, you have a number of different species living in there. They might mostly use their bedrooms or their nurseries or their bathrooms, but they might have uses for other rooms in their apartments or in that building, recreation or something like that. But the fact is that any person designing an apartment building like this must account for what they would do in the event of an emergency. So the fire escape analogy is apropos here, where you don't want to use it, but it needs to be there because you can suffer local extinctions. And when we're thinking about plans for the catastrophic, how would they escape, and also how will they return afterwards if there's a change in the forest cover? How would we connect those forest dwelling species back up? And in fact, evaluating our management, restoration, preservation plans, thinking about what could actually be a liability on the landscape, like a dam on the landscape, when in the event of a catastrophic flood becomes a liability, right? Because you're running the risk of catastrophic flooding if that dam were to break. So evaluating it in terms of these rare, but over the course of 100 or 500 year terms, somewhat likely events, I think is on all of us as land managers. And we've simulated ECEs and management plans quite effectively. I mean, prescribed fire, you could say, is a type of extreme climatic event. Girdling trees to simulate some sort of drought, so it restores the natural hydrology of an area, is something that I helped to do up in Northwest Ohio. The dam releases that brought so much controversy when they were started just about a decade ago in the Glen Canyon were highly effective at restoring sandbar communities in the Grand Canyon. And so we simulated these extreme climatic events. And so we can simulate them, we can integrate them, and I think we need to integrate how to plan for when they inevitably will occur, especially here in the Southern Great Plains. So just to conclude, individual impacts, they can be profound, and in the aggregate, they can be affecting entire species and entire communities, especially because we have already fragmented landscapes that don't have the same resilience and recovery mechanisms that they once would have had. These emergency habitats should be important parts of management plans, just the same as any fire escape would be on an apartment building. And the more we can link why we're doing this to the preservation of natural resources in the public's mind, the more likely we're going to have support for it. So with that, I'll leave it and take any questions.